Kelly Taylor Ryan, and this is Mainly Unspoken. Today our guest is Mark Finks, and he's going to be talking to us about the budget dilemma here in Maine. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Kelly. It's wonderful to do this series. We're kind of down in the nitty-gritty of where people live, which is taxing and spending.
Well, this budget dilemma is quite a dilemma.
Quite intriguing. As we tape this, I don't know when people are going to see it necessarily, but this is the fall of 2002, and the legislature is nervously reconvening to deal with a $240 million shortfall just for the immediate present. And then we're told that the new legislature coming in will have to deal with the next biennium, $900 to $1,000 million short, which would be $400 or $500 a year for every man, woman, and child in the state of Maine. That's a pretty big bite in a state which is already the most heavily taxed on the basis of per capita or usable income in the United States of America.
How do we get into this condition?
A little at a time. You don't do it all at once. You do it a little at a time. Television is a wonderful medium because people can see and hear us who will never meet us. You know, they're out there somewhere, and we're doing something different by the time they see this show, which is pre-recorded. So that's a great thing, but the downside of having a little half-hour segment with which to communicate to people is that they may or may not have seen all of our shows that came before. And we've done a show dealing with lawful money, which is the money that the founders of the United States wanted us to use, where we used coins that had the value in themselves, a gold coin, a silver coin. We had a definite weight of silver in the $1 coin, and we quoted the ounces of gold coins in dollars of silver. It was a bimetal system, very effective, and impossible to play with too much. You don't have much running room when you have to furnish a dollar that has the value in itself.
What you got is what you saw, right?
What you're holding is your wealth, exactly. And until 1964, and for a few years afterwards, but they rapidly vanished into coffee cans in people's closets, people carried silver coins in their pocket all the time. The older members of the audience will easily remember that. And since that time, the last 38 years, give or take, things haven't gone all that well in public budgeting and with the monetary system of the United States. We have prices, so-called, that are vastly inflated from what they were in the mid-60s, early 70s. Gold itself was $35 an ounce in 1971 when Nixon said we're not going to redeem the dollar anymore in international transactions for gold. That was the last redeemability left for our paper money at that time. And immediately the price of gold tripled, went up to $105 or $10. It went as high as $800, and as we're making this show, it's around $315 an ounce, give or take, which is 10 times more or less what it was in 1971.
So people that held on to gold is in a good position right now. Well,
let's say that they're not hurt in ways that other people are. They haven't had a dividend check from it. But gold has a remarkable advantage, or the two metals, the bimetal standard, which is what we should really think about with respect to the United States Constitution and state governments. The bimetal standard, it can survive governments. If the government collapses, the value is still there. If the government of the United States and or the state of Maine goes belly up, goes broke, then the currency is going to be
gone too.
Suitable for wallpaper. That would be about it.
Just like what happened in Germany.
Yes, same thing that happened to the Deutschmark in Germany between the two world wars. And the founders of this country did not want that to happen at all. And in fact, if you look at the system the way it's designed to work, the day-to-day living that people did, the jobs that they did, the goods and services that they bought, were always balanced off against the effort that it took to dig the precious metal out of the ground, to assay the ore, refine it, make it into a coin with a milled edge which could not be clipped, of a known purity and value. So things tended to stay pretty much inflation-free. If someone did a certain amount of work, then the work of creating the coin was always balanced off against that. and prices stayed pretty stable, as well as budgeting, same thing.
So are you saying that this dilemma that we're having here in Maine has been going on for the past 38 years since we went off the gold and silver standard?
Well, and actually longer than that, because once the country began playing with paper currency, even from the time of Lincoln's Banking Act in the 1860s, we were on a collision course there with much peril. The Federal Reserve Act in 1913, the Income Tax Amendment, various other things really began to work things in the United States that are completely foreign and opposed to the intention of the founders of this country.
Now, I bet you anything, a lot of people watching, they have no idea what the Federal Reserve Act is from 1913 and what effect it had on our country or on our monetary system.
Well, most everybody has read on their paper money that it's a Federal Reserve note issued by a Federal Reserve Bank, although I guess now the new ones say Federal Reserve System. They don't have the 12 letters, you know, for the 12 banks in various parts of the country. But what that actually did was grant a monopoly to a select group of private bankers to control lending and credit in this country, as well as to issue paper currency. And they started out by having a legend on there that said, this note is legal tender for all debts public and private and is redeemable in lawful money at the United States Treasury or at any Federal Reserve Bank, meaning you could go to the Treasury and they would give you gold or silver for it, or you could go to the Reserve Bank, they would do the same thing.
So they were admitting that their Federal Reserve notes was not lawful money by saying you could redeem it.
Yes, this is not lawful money, but you can redeem it for lawful money. And actually a note has to say who will pay what to whom when.
So it's not even a note.
It's not even a note, because it doesn't say that it's going to give you something. The silver certificate met that requirement. It said there is on deposit in the Treasury of the United States $1 in silver payable to the bearer on demand.
So when the Federal Reserve Act was made back in 1913, our monetary system took a dramatic change in direction.
Yes, and not perceived by most people. The father of the famous aviator, Charles Lindbergh Sr., not the junior who did the flying, but the father, who was in the Congress at the time Congress did this, spent the rest of his adult life traveling around the United States as long as he was able, trying to explain to the American people what they had done to themselves. He said, you don't want to do something like this because eventually your entire country will be leveraged. You're giving this bank monopoly the opportunity to control lending and credit. They're eventually going to own you. They'll just keep loaning you, they'll keep creating money and loaning it to you until you're so far in hock that they'll own you.
And we are.
We're there.
We are there.
We are there and past there. And in fact, the United States, and in fact, this will be kind of a big pill to swallow for the viewers maybe, but the United States admitted that it was broke in 1971 when Nixon closed the gold window. I'm sorry, we don't have any gold to back this up, so hey, just value it for whatever it'll bring. See, that's the deal. And we've gotten ourselves, we're talking about the state of Maine's budgeting dilemma. We could, I suppose, talk about the federal one too, but the point is that once you have nothing definite as a unit to work with, a unit weight of silver, everything's up for grabs. And inevitably inflation is going to destroy any effort to have a stable budgeting process because everything's going to keep increasing in price.
So are you saying that the state of Maine, let alone the federal government, will never be able to get our budget balanced in a healthy way?
How can you ultimately pay a debt with a debt? All we're doing is transferring the ownership of debt from one party to another. That's it. So you got a bunch of debt units in your checking account, and I give you some more paper money, or I write you a check denominated in nothings, you know, in these I owe you $1 plus interest dollars. So now you've got a little bigger pile of debt units in your banking account. That's all you have. There's nothing inherent in value in those things, so you better spend them or do something with them before they lose too much value. And we're in what amounts to a death spiral doing that. You can't ultimately become prosperous by exchanging or transacting debt instruments. That's what we're doing.
So what's going to happen to the budget in Maine?
Well, they're going to have some job trying to deal with this one. Even the shortfall right now, they claim through various difficult manipulations to have some means of covering the 240 million. But when they get to the 1,000 million for the next biennium in 2003, 2004, they're really going to be up against it because they've already used all of their tricks and have no more tricks. So what do we do now?
Kind of like the stock market. They ran out of tricks, right?
Ran out of tricks, and all of the
team failed.
Kiting and hyping. Well, you can see why people, the heart of some of the misconduct on the corporation's part had to do with hiding their debt. Or stating it as an asset instead of a liability and all this kind of stuff.
That creative accounting.
Creative accounting. It kind of fits. The government's been doing it to us for years with the Social Security system, the so-called Social Security system. What's secure about Social Security? They, in effect, have been unwilling to acknowledge some of these liabilities. They've run Social Security and other things off budget or with their own little special place to live. There is no actual trust fund that's invested. It's just income in and transfer payments out and a deficit at the end. And
so what's going to be happening to, we're going to be having a new governor in November.
Oh, in Maine, yeah.
Okay, in Maine, okay. Yeah. What's going to happen? He's going to look at this mess. I mean, you can see all the people like Chinchet and Baldacci saying, you know, they're going to take care of this budget. And
they always say that. They're going to reform.
They're going to reform.
Reshape. Reform means to shape again. So I would ask any of those guys, what shape is it in now? That is, if we've spent quite a while in this series of programs explaining the representative form of government. It's supposed to have balanced, separated powers, and it's supposed to have operating checks and balances and so forth. And actually, in our modern way of doing things, we have such a bunch of technocrat administrators running everything from the federal to the local level, all locked together by a system of self-perpetuating regulation, that to try to control that with a budget process is really virtually impossible, because you've in effect said, we've defined this task, which is very open-ended, a lot of entitlement language and all this other stuff, and then let these guys publish regulations under which they do business for decades, and now you've made this hopeless mess that will very much resist any effort to curb it. We're kind of like Rome at the end, just before it collapsed, where they just had enormous amounts of code law and regulation that they had written, all for special interest purposes, either for a special interest in the bureaucratic elite or a special interest in the business sector, some piece of stuff that had been created. And that made Rome completely vulnerable to collapse financially, because they didn't have the money to pay for this stuff. And the United States is very much in that same position. We have a currency of psychological value, and we have the Europeans manipulating things to try to make the euro, the European currency, the world currency of reference instead of the dollar. Even though our dollar is unbacked, it fares better than some other national currencies around the world who have an even less credible budget process and less financial discipline than we do, and we have the sheer size of the American economy, which everybody hopes is going to do them some good someday. So at the moment, we're the currency of reference for the world, but the Europeans want to make the euro the currency of reference, in which case the dollar is going to take a dive in value because of that.
Do you think that when you made reference, we're kind of like where Rome was when their financial system, ended? Is our financial system going to end?
Well, it sure isn't healthy. We know that. And here's a little thought question for the viewer. We've said several times in this series, and it bears repeating even in this show, that you need to decide for yourself whether you believe that there is such a thing as right and wrong, and whether you believe that God exists or he doesn't. Because our system of government was founded upon the belief in a creator, the one that you believe in, not necessarily the one somebody else believes in. But the principles of right and wrong and honest dealing, the use of a single weight in order to do transactions, is a very important biblical principle.
And our government has gotten away from that honest dealing with money.
Well, sure. We're paying back smaller dollars than we borrow. And everybody just says, oh, well, and if they're giving back less value than what they borrowed. So the whole system accelerates in inflation, and the only way they quote control that is through the outrageous manipulation of the system. We have a virtually dead horse that we're riding. We got the poor horse, you know, choked almost to death by having the interest rates artificially low. That's to give him a little encouragement. You let him breathe enough air so he doesn't die. He doesn't fall down. He's still trying to operate. You know, the poor American public is trying to use the money they have, which is this I owe you $1 plus interest money. It doesn't work all that great, but by keeping the interest rates way down, the system struggles along a few more feet. If interest rates were to rise, the economy would would be like a rotten squash hitting a wall, just splat. That would be it.
So if you were governor in November, okay, if we elected Mark Finks as governor,
sure,
which I think would be an excellent idea.
I'm not running, folks. Really, I'm not.
What would you do with the budget dilemma?
Well, I think it would be profoundly necessary. Interestingly enough, the series that we've done for cable television that explains the Constitution and what the founders set out to do, someone has to, in a pretty candid, straightforward way, explain what the founders intended for us. Because people stand up and cheer when you tell them that. They say, yeah, wow, that's great. I love those principles. They're just wonderful. And then you say, however, we have built upon this bureaucratic mess, which is all hat and no cattle. You know, it has a fancy hat but no cows. There's no value out there to pay for all of this when you really get right down to it. That's why we're experiencing these budget crunches, because the economy just won't sustain it. And if that's true, then people have to be willing to look at other means of accomplishing things. It is one of the sad ironies of our day that the government schools eat most of the tax money. And yet their results are pathetic in comparison with the results achieved by homeschoolers and various kinds of parochial and private schools on far less money. It's an amazing thing that we've made such a bureaucratic system that's in lockstep now all the way to Washington, and it's helpless to educate the young.
So it sounds like you're telling me the first thing you have to do is clean out the bureaucracy that's taking all the money or sucking all the money out.
The combination of the administrative weight, as it's collapsing under its own weight, both financially and administratively, has made a situation that is really catastrophic. And people need to be told that, and they need to be asked to say, okay, if this is true, and we think it's pretty obvious that it's true, what do we do now? What do we do now? And a free choice of educational method would be smart. I'm not a fan of vouchers, and I'm not a fan of charter schools. All this stuff is a sneaky way to keep the government in control of everybody and everything. That's what it is. But if you really say, all right, we're going to stop pretending that we can pay for this and do this, we're going to have people decide for themselves how they're going to deal with it. Maybe they'll privatize their local school system, go back to the town academies and so forth. A great friend of mine who worked for the state of Maine for almost 40 years was a statistician for mental health and corrections, and he did a detailed study comparing the Gardner SAD 11 consolidated high school with Bridge Academy in Dresden. He had been a trustee of both. He was a trustee at Bridge, and he also had served on the school board at the Gardner District High School, and had been a supporter of consolidation when it came in. He said, oh, this is great. We're going to have a developmental program for teachers. There's going to be a teacher's school within the high school. They actually had meeting rooms and things set aside for that. That never happened. A lot of the things that were supposed to happen there never happened. And he finally decided after a period of years, he began to suspect that the district high school wasn't doing all that well, and he compared carefully his interviews with graduates of the district high school with graduates of Bridge Academy. And it didn't matter what category you used, the trades or white-collar employment or anything else, post-secondary education, everything he looked at, Bridge Academy had it all over the district high school. And he just said, that's it, I resign, I'm through. This is a bust, you know.
Okay, so you're saying that schools are a big drain and they don't pay off for what they say they're going to do?
They're probably counterproductive. What they're actually doing now, it's a political strategy. Since the Nations at Risk report in '84, whenever that thing came out, it's been 15 or 20 years now almost. What they've done is sort of circle the wagons and made so-called public-private partnerships where they, in effect, are going to control people's employment using the government schools. That was the technique that the Soviets used with the Polytech system, and it failed, you know, and we don't want to see that here in the United States. But it's just a political strategy to keep everybody on the train, you know. Don't jump off the train. We've got a better thing coming down the line. See?
What's going to happen to the budget, though? Okay, what's going to happen to our school systems? Are they going to have to close down? Will they be forced to close down or to get smaller? Are people going to say, hey, we don't want it? We're going to have to...
For this round of budget agony, the $240 million thing, they've postponed some stuff, but haven't reduced any of the payments to the schools. But boy, in the next go-round, for the $1,000 million shortfall, guaranteed, that's going to be on the table for discussion. And there'll be a lot of weeping, wailing, and gnashing of teeth because we've made a very elaborate set of buildings in Maine, bricks and mortar all over the place. And those are town bonds, which are supported by state subsidies. You cut back the subsidies, the towns are all on the hook to pay the bonds without any state help.
Oh my God, would you say that one more time?
Well, check out the fine print. Those are town bonds. Those construction bonds are town bonds. And that was a key element of the strategy with the education funding law in 1974. The clever Svengalis who foisted that on the Maine people of Maine knew perfectly well that if you got all these towns to build these schools with town bonds, that you could never repeal the education funding law because it would take all the subsidy away and the towns would have to pay 100% of the school bond off the property tax.
So we're not catch-22 here.
We're in a very tough spot, and there were some empire builders in the Department of Education who literally traveled the state. The minute that bill passed the legislature, buy your buses and build your schools. It's all for free, they said. And I say, yeah, like fun, it's for free. Courtesy of you, you know, you're going to pay for it all, and we're going to promise to pay you something, and you guys are the biggest suckers in the world, but we're not going to tell you that up front, or you won't buy anything. Because Mainers were cautious in the 70s about school budgeting, and the restraint kind of went out the window on the promises of all this subsidy, which never actually, the state never actually lived up to the figures that they'd promised, and still haven't to this day, in terms of the so-called state share of public education. They're still paying less than what they'd promised to pay years ago.
So whoever gets into the Blaine house, they're going to have to bite the bullet. And
should, yes, they have to.
They have to.
Yeah.
They're not going to have a choice. They may talk around and manipulate things, but they're going to have to streamline what they're spending on schools.
So-called. And actually, somebody will have to have the courage to actually say, you know, a system this bureaucratic and this centrally planned all the way to Washington can't continue to exist. There's no money to pay for it.
And you think they're going to come out and say that to the Maine citizens? And what about all these mothers and fathers who want a great education for their children?
Well, they might look honestly at some of the results other people are getting with homeschooling, Protestant and Catholic parochials and others. Now, it's true that the churches pay some of the costs of running those schools, but they're also excess capacity. They use education wings that are only used on Sundays and Wednesday evenings. They use them, you know, Monday through Friday school. So they get some very significant extra efficiency there and all. The homeschoolers are incredibly efficient, because in a relatively small time segment each day, they have no difficulty keeping their children current where they should be in the grade level. They don't have all that other Mickey Mouse, the busing back and forth, the lining up for lunch, and all the stuff that goes on in government schools. They save a lot of time. Now, they have to work through the dilemma of who is going to teach their child. One parent's going to be working, the other parent's going to be home teaching.
So you're saying actually that the people of Maine are going to have to become much more self-efficient and much more creative to get the things for their children themselves, because the state of Maine, they're just not going to come through with what they've been...
Yeah, I think it's a fair statement that this whole bureaucratic system of doing things has had 25, 30 years in which to work its wonderful magic, and has failed miserably. They'll leap into the breach and say, oh, but we have the best test scores of all the government schools in the United States of America. This proves that we're great. And I say, no, it proves that you're the best of the worst, because American government schools are mediocre, so you're at the top of the mediocre pile. Bully for you. And look what you spent doing it. And look what you did to this state doing it. Look at the political transformation, the manipulation, and all the other sniveling stuff that's done. Nobody ever came right out and acknowledged this before. The only reason that they're going to have to now is that we're in this budget crunch. Otherwise, they'd let her roll. Why not? They're benefiting directly from this, personally, professionally. They're getting the salaries and the state retirement and all the other stuff that goes with it. Who's going to rock the boat? You know?
But they're going up against something. But it's really interesting with the schools, when the kids graduate, the government schools aren't training the kids to ask the right questions, so we don't get into a budget dilemma like we're in today.
Well, they're kind of go along to get along.
Go along to get along.
Kids these days. But a friend of mine has made a career in the post-secondary world. She used to teach here at the University of Southern Maine, and is now as a tenured professor of English in Canada. She's a native of a Canadian citizen and so forth. But her career has been primarily involved with teaching creative writing in a way that will help remediate what the high schools are not accomplishing. She got all these horrendously incompetent students from the high schools of Maine when she taught at USM, and she had to do something about it. So she wrote a standard textbook, a reference work on the subject, has lectured all over the place, and is doing the same in Canada. Canada has some of the same problems that we have with public budgeting and the whole dilemma of how you run this monolithic government school system. So she's dealing with the same thing in Canada. We've been talking about this back and forth for maybe 15 years, and there are a number of people around the country who are trying to deal with this. We're producing rather poor students for big bucks, for lots of money. Now, does that make any sense?
No,
I say not. You know?
Right now, we're, what, 240 million? Is it?
Yeah, well, they claim to have, the latest and greatest claim is that they've got some kind of a methodology, and they now think that in a week or two they can go back in and squeak by on this one. But
more smoke and mirrors, probably.
But the big one is coming up in the next session with the 1,000 million shortfall.
1,000 million short, so
Yeah.
it'll be interesting what they come up with. We have about 30 seconds. What's the one thing you want everyone to remember about this budget dilemma?
Well, folks, you know, when things are this messed up, then probably they're as bad as you think they are. I mean, have we now reached the point where the budget matters are so serious that we can say this is a bunch of bunk, and there needs to be some candor here and some soul searching, and the state of Maine, these bureaucrats, these obsessive empire builders, have got to let go of our necks, you know, with both their hands and say, all right, we give up, we tried, we didn't succeed, so it's your decision, see. And I don't think that'll happen, but I wish it would.
All right, Mark, thanks for coming again.
It's a pleasure.
We'll see you again soon.
Okay.
All right. Well, the state of Maine certainly has a budget problem, and I don't think anyone running for Maine governor is going to be able to solve it. So the people have got to solve it, and the people have got to start asking themselves what they want from their government and take charge. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.